Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SCA's 38th monthly Zoom presentation. We're now into our fourth year with no end in sight. My name is Brian Gallagher, and I'm the Vice President of the Society for Commercial Archaeology. I will be your host tonight. Welcome to all our guests, and particularly followers of the History Department at the University of Maryland, and any other new people we have tonight. We're happy you took the time out of your spring evening to watch an SCA presentation. I hope you enjoy this show. It's actually summer now. It started yesterday. And for anyone watching the recording of this episode of the SCA's monthly presentations who is not a member of the SCA, we earnestly ask you to consider joining. Funding for the various activities of the SCA comes almost exclusively from our membership. Just visit our website at www.sca-roadside.org and follow the links. Now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's presentation. Professor Thomas Zeller will talk tonight about how the view from our cars reflects our view of societies and ourselves. His presentation is based on his book, Consuming Landscapes: What We See When We Drive and Why It Matters. When the automobile was still young, an early 20th century group of designers sought to build scenic roads that would immerse drivers in the landscapes that they were traversing. As such, these professionals predicted that cars and roads, if properly managed, would be the saviors of the environment. As cars became more popular, however, drivers became less interested in enchanted views, and safety became more important than beauty. These clashes between the differing objectives of drivers and thus designers resulted in alternate visions of landscapes made for automobiles and the kinds of roads that we drive today. Thomas Zeller is Associate Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, USA, where he teaches environmental history, the history of technology, and science and technology studies. And his book, which he'll talk about tonight, was reviewed in the latest version or latest issue of the SCA Journal. You can see that review there. Professor Zeller, if you would like to start screen sharing, and please give us your presentation, and then we will look forward to questions and answers at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming out on the longest day of the year, June 21st. And I will try to share my screen now and hope that I will be successful in that endeavor. Does it work, Brian?
Yes, it looks fine. You've got it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So again, thanks everybody for coming out tonight, and welcome to those of you who are watching the recording afterwards. And it's really an honor to talk to an audience of people who are interested in the roadside by definition, right? As members of the Society for Commercial Archaeology. So I'm talking to a group of people who are interested in roadside attractions, in neon signs, in drive-ins, and in diners. But the roads that I will talk about today in the next 29 minutes or so, in fact, presented a much more austere version of the road. So these were roads that were all about the landscape. They were about trees. They were about mountains. They were about scenery. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where these ideas came from and what forms they took, both in the United States and in Germany, which are the two countries that I'm looking at in this book that was published in the fall of 22. But before I do that, I wanted to say a little bit about how I came to the topic. People often wonder how authors, especially academics, arrive at a topic. Why does one spend several years researching the book, getting it through peer review, and in fact, getting it published? So in my case, in the case of this particular book, it was an intermingled personal and academic story. I finished my PhD in Germany in 1999, was lucky to find a job in Atlanta, taught there for a year, and then got another job in Philadelphia. So I was going to pack what little I owned at that point, put it in a car and drive from Atlanta to Philly. And one colleague in Atlanta who had grown up in New Jersey and who had made similar trips several times before, told me about a road that I had never heard about. He said there's something called the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's a 2-lane road. It's for automobiles only. It's very scenic, but he also didn't quite like it. It was too slow for him. There was a speed limit, but also the design of the road slowed people down. So this got me interested in the topic of these scenic roads. Why was there a 469-mile road only for automobiles, not for trucks, in a somewhat remote location? Why was it designed in a way that made it look quite manicured, if you will? So as an academic, right, I began to read my way into the history of the Blue Ridge Parkway, of other parkways, of other scenic roads. I found out that there was a similar road in Germany, in Bavaria, called the German Alpine Road. And so this interest in these roads, and eventually with many detours and so on, led me to researching and writing books. So it grows out of my interest in the history of the built environment. When I teach classes here in College Park in Maryland on the history of transportation, and as Brian said, history of technology and environmental history as well. So what is this book about? In a nutshell, the book explores how ways of perceiving nature, landscapes, and more generally the non-human world while driving cars have changed throughout the 20th century. And in particular, I'm interested in these roads that were planned, especially in the first half of the 20th century, as scenic roads. Roads whose main goal was not to provide efficient, fast, direct transportation, but their main goal rather was to immerse people in scenery, in landscapes that were presented as beautiful, as verdant, as attractive. So the two case studies, as I mentioned, are the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia and North Carolina in the United States, and the German Alpine Road in Germany. And as I argue in the book, there were groups of professional planners in the first several decades of the 20th century who envisioned and championed these scenic roads. Most prominently, there were landscape architects and civil engineers. They were involved in mostly successful, but sometimes also uneasy professional relationships. And their goal was not just to make car trips an aesthetically rewarding experience. They really wanted to reconnect drivers and passengers with the landscapes that they traversed. And they sought a mobile experience, an automotive experience that was a departure from the dominant mode of transportation at the time, which of course was still the railroads in both countries. Right? Railroad travel was fast, it was convenient, it took you to most places more comfortably than any other mode of transportation for the first half of the 20th century. And in contrast to railroad travel, automotive explorations on these scenic roads were to immerse drivers and passengers in landscapes and were to enable them to experience these landscapes in ways that would not be possible by using railroads. And these ideas for scenic roads became realities on the ground in both Germany and the United States throughout the first decades of the 20th century, but there was a particular boom during the 1930s. At a time when national governments directed resources to scenic roads as work relief projects, and the historical background, of course, was the Great Depression and putting people to work during the greatest economic calamity of the 20th century. And so what I do in this book, In Consuming Landscapes, is to ask why these ideas to plan and build scenic roads held sway in both countries during the first half of the 20th century, and especially because their political modes of government became fundamentally opposed by the 1930s, with the United States continuing to be a liberal democracy and Germany turning into a fascist dictatorship. And I hasten to add, especially since this talk is being recorded, that comparing Germany and the United States, and in particular the New Deal under Roosevelt and similar projects under National Socialism, does not mean equating. Comparing does not mean equating. I'm not saying that these two countries, their political modes of governance, were alike. Rather, what I'm interested in is the transatlantic exchange of ideas, technologies, and ways of seeing, as well as the distinct differences. They become very pronounced, I think, in the actual analysis of the planning of these roads, with a more participatory planning regime, although one that still did not take local voices into account in the United States, and as one would expect, a much more dictatorial planning regime in Nazi Germany. So beauty in politics, aesthetics and governance, and private acts of driving, and the visible hand of government were all intertwined in the course of the history of these roads. So here's a visual example of what I'm talking about. Here's an image of the Blue Ridge Parkway from the 1950s, a bucolic scene, right, with sheep grazing and wooden fences and this lone car traversing one of the many curves of the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's a picture produced by the National Park Service, which operates this road up until today for national distribution. The contrasting image is one that could be anywhere, right? It happens to be in Kansas, but one of the many important points of the US interstate highway system, of course, is its uniformity. So no matter where you find yourself, the width of the road, the signs, curvature are all the same, and they're very predictable. Whereas a parkway such as the Blue Ridge Parkway, in many ways, is about surprise and enjoyment, and as I said, immersing oneself in the landscape. So the picture on the right speaks to ideas of a very utilitarian design, right? It's a road for automobiles and for trucks, which is supposed to move as quickly as possible. And we all know that that's an ideal, not the reality. Whereas the goal of the parkway is one of scenic immersion. Both of these roads are free from traffic lights. Both of these roads are limited access highways with entry and exit ramps. One of them is free of billboards, stores, gas stations, and commercial vehicles. So what I ask in the book is not only how do we get from one to the other, but also what were the motivating factors for either versions of these roads, and why did national government sponsor different types of roads at different points. And what I arrive at in the book are these entanglements. So this is Fortune magazine, the cover of Fortune magazine from June 1938, which devotes a significant portion of the magazine talking about parkways that had been built in New York and its vicinity under Robert Moses, the planner that some people in the audience will be familiar with. I'll come back to him in a second. So these are the types of entanglements, the transatlantic exchanges between the US, Germany, and other places that I want to talk about in this book. So here's one example of an early parkway, one that has gained quite a bit of prominence in the historical literature. It's a very small road in terms of mileage, but it's a road that left a very important mark in the literature on designing automobiles. So it's the Bronx River Parkway, built in Westchester County, just north of New York City. The landscape architect who designed this road was Gilmore Clark. You see a slide of Clark in just a second. The politician for whom Clark worked on this road and then on many, many other roads was Robert Moses, who enjoyed this outsized career in planning today. For the purposes of this presentation and this society, the SCA, it's worth noting that the Bronx River Parkway and the design of this road was very strict about avoiding any kind of billboards, references to commercial activities. Bronx River Parkway was built in the river valley, right? The Bronx River, obviously, that had been somewhat polluted, was full of billboards. All these billboards had to go. There were occasional dwellings of poor recent immigrants, many of them Italian American, who lived in the river valley. These dwellings were razed, people were resettled for the construction of the road. And once people drove on these roads, what they saw instead was this very park-like, verdant, bucolic experience that you see here. Trucks were banned, as they were on other parkways in the US as well, in order to achieve this kind of pleasant driving experience. Just last fall, there was a play that was shown first in London and then in New York with Ray Fiennes playing Robert Moses. The play was called Straight Like Crazy. I didn't manage to get tickets to the play because it sold out immediately, but I managed to see a recording of it, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to see a drama about planning and infrastructure planning. It's not always historically accurate. In fact, there's many instances where it's inaccurate, but it's great. It's great theater. So about these two case studies. So you see two maps here. On the left, the Blue Ridge Parkway, as I said, in Virginia, North Carolina, 469 miles. The German Alpine Road on the right, with Munich at the so right here, if you can see my cursor, and this is the northern rim of the Alp. This is Lake Constance on the left. Given that there were so many parkways in the United States, you might ask, why did I pick these two roads? Why not others? I made that choice because these two roads were and are the most extensive scenic roads sponsored by the central government of either country, sponsored by the central governments of Germany and the United States. And both roads, in fact, achieved national stature, were advertised as national roads rather than just regional ones. And even in terms of actual altitude, the physical location of these roads is quite similar, because the German road is in the foothills of the Alps, not in its highest regions. Most stretches of both roads, the Blue Ridge Parkway, the German Alpine Road, are close to the 2,500 feet mark. So both of these roads, the Blue Ridge Parkway, the German Alpine Road, had been proposed, had been envisioned, had been suggested by local tourism elites, chambers of commerce from the 1920s onwards. But there was very little actual construction up until the 1930s. And you see this drastic picture here of the road being dynamited out of the mountains. The main reason for the roads not being built before the 1930s were mostly the costs, the very, very high costs of building these roads in subalpine regions, regions of high elevations. The tourism promoters who suggested building these roads wanted to build these roads as a way to attract tourists, and to attract tourists who arrived in automobiles rather than by train. And they reasoned, quite accurately, that people who arrived by automobile in the 20s and the 30s would have more money to spend than people who arrived by train. State governments, administrators, civil engineers, planners in general listened to these proposals in the 20s and the 1930s, but they steadfastly ignored them. Because, as I mentioned, the cost would have been high, and also because most civil engineers were not comfortable with the idea of building roads to create traffic. Especially the Bureau of Public Roads in the United States, the foremost federal agency charged with thinking about highways on a national scale. The Bureau of Public Roads wanted to respond to existing traffic rather than to create traffic where there wasn't a lot of. And of course, in these remote parts of Appalachia, in Virginia and North Carolina, there was very little existing traffic. These were not just geographically, but also economically marginal regions with much higher incidence of poverty. And so it's only with the New Deal in the United States and the Nazi regime's counterpart of public works that the political conditions for a wider embrace for the idea of scenic roads became a reality. Central governments in Berlin and Washington, D.C. embraced these roads as work creation efforts, as a means to put an activist government on display. They employed metropolitan planners to bring forth national scenic roads in relatively remote settings with the Blue Ridge Parkway and the German Alpine roads. And I would argue that these roads are much longer, more extensive, and the implications much broader than these previous examples, these suburban roads such as the Bronx River Parkway. So who were some of these individuals who were involved? So on the upper right here, you see Gilmore Clark, who really made a name for himself as a landscape architect whose career was very closely aligned with parkways in the United States. One of his co-workers, one of his former students, someone who worked for him on suburban parkways, became the first superintendent of the Blue Ridge Parkway, right? As a unit of the National Park Service, it has the Blue Ridge Parkway has a superintendent. And the National Park Service, in fact, as some historians have observed, by the 1930s was really dominated by landscape architects who created these particular visions of nature. On the lower right, the individual there is Getty Browning, who was the chief locating engineer for the road in its North Carolina. In North Carolina, he was employed by the State Highway Commission, the civil engineer who had roots in Western Maryland. And Browning, really interestingly, took it upon himself to hike the entire length of the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina in order to find what he thought would be the best location for the road, meaning the one with the highest scenic surplus, right? The road that would enable drivers to have long views over several ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, and the road that would constantly sort of surprise them and expose passengers and drivers to constantly changing views. On the upper left, you have Alvin Seifert, who's a landscape architect who worked for the German Autobahn project. The Autobahn, as many of you will know, was a real pet project of the Nazis, of Hitler in particular, was way overbuilt, was built 30 years ahead of demand. There was really no demand for it. The military was not in favor of the road either. But the regime, and the Nazi regime and Hitler in particular, wanted to have this road as something that could aid in its propaganda as a way to showcase the infrastructural abilities of this new regime. So Seifert was also involved in planning the German Alpine roads on the northern rim of the Alps. Seifert's boss, if you will, was a civil engineer by the name of Fritz Todd, whom you see on the slide below with this model. He was trained as a civil engineer and also loved hiking and outdoorsy activities. And he also, hiked several stretches of what became the German Alpine roads. And Browning and Todd were both engineers who envisioned roads as new infrastructures that were uniquely suited to create a new mobile experience of the landscape. However, and again, I want to be very clear about this, I do not make the claim that there was a political equivalence, that these two people were alike in their political opinions. Browning was far from being a member of a totalitarian government. Todd, on the other hand, had joined the Nazi Party very early on before it came into power, had no regard for democratic procedures of governance, and wanted to build this road as fast as he could and took local opinion into no regard whatsoever. Because of these political differences, some of the common design features of these roads are quite remarkable, I would think. So in the case of the New Deal and the United States, the Blue Ridge Parkway, you see a finished section here, was subject to a lot of political debates. A big question was whether the southern terminus of the road would be in Tennessee or in North Carolina. There were public hearings, local politicians who argued in favor of their respective states, congressional delegations, letters to the editor, what have you. Washington, D.C. and the New Deal administration and Roosevelt then decided that it would be North Carolina that would get the prize. In both cases, locals and their dwellings who lived on what became the roads, were resettled, their dwellings were razed, and they were moved elsewhere. The Blue Ridge Parkway was eventually built on its entire length of 469 miles. Local tourism officials in the two states that I just mentioned, and then of course the federal government with its support and most importantly the financing of the road were behind completing the roads. Locals, of course, who were displaced were either left grumbling, and they also had little use for a ridgetop road. I mean, there's clear evidence that they would have preferred a road down in the valleys rather than one on the ridgetops. And another group that was displeased with the Blue Ridge Parkway were hikers, people who wanted solitude and quiet in the mountains rather than roads and automobiles. One of the people who had argued for scenic roads earlier on, and Brian mentioned this in his review of my book in the SCA newsletter, was Louis Mumford. Many of you will have heard of Mumford as this ardent car critic from the 1960s onwards, right? In fact, one of the most vocal critics, one of the most prominent critics of Robert Moses in the 60s. In the 20s and the 30s, Moses believed, and quite sincerely believed, that roads and automobiles, if they were properly managed, could in fact reconcile drivers and passengers. He really was impressed by many of these early scenic roads, such as the Bronx River Parkway. The Blue Ridge Parkway, not so much, especially because it was built on the ridgetops themselves rather than sort of taking turns between lower elevations and higher elevations and staying on the what's called the flank line. So I can say more about this during the Q&A if people want to. So very briefly about the German Alpine Road before I finish here. You see the location of the road within what was Germany in the late 1930s. I should also point out that these other roads here are all imaginary. They were not built in this particular manner, of course, during the 1930s or afterwards. For the regime, for the Nazi regime, the German Alpine Road was a really important piece of propaganda. These totalitarian regimes want to celebrate their supposed achievements, and so infrastructural achievement, all the more if they include elements of natural beauty, were parts of the propaganda. And this is the cover of a book that celebrated the German Alpine Road. So here's one of the stretches of the road that was in fact built. The German Alpine Road was never finished according to its original plans. The main reason, of course, being the preparation for war, the way the German economy was realigned, if you will, to start a war of aggression by 1939. And so all resources were directed towards the war effort by 1939, if not earlier. In these guidebooks, the German Alpine Road was presented not just as a way of experiencing nature, but it was also advertised as a token of consumerism, as a new way of enabling people to drive, and which was still relatively novel at the time. Automobiles before the 1950s, 60s, really in Germany, were mostly owned by middle and upper class members of society. There was no sort of German version of the Model T that brought automobility to the masses. But when I say that these roads were advertised as the part of a consumer society, I should also mention that this was a racially defined consumer society, and one that was politically defined as well. So Germans defined as Jewish were no longer allowed to own automobiles and had to give up their driver's licenses by the late 1930s. As we all know, political enemies of the regime, social democrats, liberals, communists, were put in concentration camps. So when historians talk about a consumer society in Nazi Germany, it is, of course, one that is exclusive. It is, of course, one that is restricted to members of that society who are in line, both racially and politically. So here's a poster that advertises happy summer weeks in southern Bavaria. What I'm really struck by is sort of the lower half of the poster shows you the sort of traditional Bavarian architecture, the people dressed in vacation garb. But then the mountains have all these infrastructures, right? There's a cable car that goes to the top. There's a mountain road that will whisk you to the top of the mountain without exerting a lot of effort. So, as I mentioned, this kind of consumerism was exclusionary. This is an image of the German Autobahn, where Dachau, the site of the first concentration camp, is an exit here, where you would exit on the right. So terror and consumerism, if you will, were closely intertwined. I want to come to my final image here and make a few the concluding remarks, and then I'm really curious to hear your questions. Again, this is an audience of people that knows a lot about the roadside, probably knows more than I will ever forget. So what I write about in this book, In Consuming Landscapes, is this international movement for scenic roads. These scenic roads had no single point of origin, either geographically or chronologically. There were several individuals, however, organized movements, professionals, and state agencies that pushed for these scenic roads and made sure that they stayed high on the political and cultural agenda. And what's also interesting is that these roads were what I call relational roads. They related to another mode of transportation. They're very much related to the railroads. They wanted to replace the experience of railroad travel with pollution, with soot, with steam emanating from steam engines. They wanted to replace that kind of experience with what was assumed to be a cleaner version, a more natural, a more landscape-friendly version of travel. And of course, by the 21st century, right, it is car travel that has become a major source, and truck transportation, which have become major sources of pollution. What's also notable is that these roads were the sites and the results of political conflicts. There were constant tensions between central planners, professionals, civil engineers, landscape architects who lived in and had been trained in cities. And they created these visions of these rural landscapes for drivers and passengers with little regard for the people who lived in these areas. And I mentioned resettlement, which also displacement and resettlement, which also occurred in the case of the Blue Ridge Parkway, where dwellings were razed, people had to leave their livelihoods through eminent domain. And so the final point that I want to end on is a quote that you've seen up here on the slide. This is a cultural geographer by the name of Stephen Daniels, who talks about the duplicity of landscapes. Daniels talks about landscapes such as this one being able to hide conflicts. There's a very glossy, very attractive, of course, veneer of beauty, which hides some of these conflicts and disagreements that went into the history of these roads. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you again for your time. I'll very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I read the book and I wrote the review, and I still found it to be fascinating and very well presented. But one thing you didn't touch on, and maybe you could take a few minutes because we have a bit of time here, is so the scenic parkways, you covered that quite well. But what about the move to the non-scenic parkways? In other words, the interstate system. And it's I found it fascinating that you had a quote there from a cultural geographer at the end. And a cultural geographer that I'm familiar with, of course, his son, I can't remember his first name, is Kunstler, but he wrote the book, The Geography of Nowhere. And that seems to me to be a great title for the roads that we drive today. In other words, the interstate system. Can you take 5 minutes or so to talk about how did we get from the byways to the interstate?
Right. So that's sort of the latter chapters of the book, right? Because of course we don't end up with these parkways, right? So after World War II, I mean, let me sort of backtrack for one thing. So the German Autobahn had been built for trucks and automobiles from the beginning. But of course, in the case of American parkways, trucks and all kinds of commercial vehicles, like even ambulances, were excluded, right? The National Park Service made sure that no ambulance would be able to use the parkway. So after World War II, there's a new wave of criticism directed against these roads. The most obvious lobby arguing against these roads are truckers and the trucking lobby, right? They're saying we're spending all this public money on these roads, but they cannot be used to move freight. And they argue that this benefits the railroads. And they say if it is a public road, it should be that, right? It should be public. It should be open to anyone. So that's one big factor is to plan these roads as being accessible to anyone. There's also a bit of a sort of an institutional history. So I live and work inside the Beltway, and what you have, of course, very often are these competing federal agencies, right? So the National Park Service, part of the Department of Interior, very much wants to build these scenic roads, right, in the vein that I just talked about. Bureau of Public Roads, which in the immediate post-war period is part of the Department of Agriculture, then becomes part of Commerce. They, of course, are much more in favor of roads that enable trucking and truck transportation as a way to create competition between the railroads and trucking companies. Right, so there's the railroads from the late 19th century onwards, had been the subject of a lot of criticism. They were monopolists, right? Their freight rates were constantly under attack. So if you can create ways for an alternate mode of moving freight, that's all very welcome from the point of view of these parts of the federal government. The third and final point is safety. There's a huge outcry in the post-war period about deaths and accidents on the roads, right? Most people are familiar with Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed, the creation of a new federal agency, and so on. And the argument that holds sway in the 50s and the 60s is that roads that are more predictable, right? The interstates that look the same, whether you're in Maine or in Kansas or Washington State, or in fact, you can go to Hong Kong, right? Or any place in Africa that has an interstate highway, it'll be very similar. And in fact, it's the argument is that it's the predictability of these roads that makes them safer, rather than these parkways which are built around experience, surprise, and scenic views. So that's sort of the short answer to that.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now we have some questions from the audience. I'll pose them, and if the person who posed them would like to speak, just send me a chat and we'll open up the microphone for you. The first one is from Melanie Solomon, and I think this is an interesting question. It says, did the parkway planners also have a role in planning support services like gas stations and motels?
Yeah, for the Park Service, of course, the idea is to build a complete sort of ensemble, if you will, right? So the Blue Ridge Parkway itself is this very thin ribbon, which is the land that's owned by the federal government. So what the planners built are rest areas. They plan sort of overlooks, places where you can stop your car and go for short hikes. They leave the development of gas stations and then motels to private interests down in the valley, which is different from other national parks, right? Where you think of sort of the classical 19th century model of national parks with Yellowstone and Yosemite, where the hotels are very much a part of the planning. But lots of attention is being directed to campsites, rest areas, and campsites that in the Jim Crow South are originally planned as segregated for Americans defined as Black and white Americans, and then the federal government ends this practice of segregation as well. So the planners really sought to plan as much as possible. So it's a great question.
Okay, Jeremy Ebersole asks, do I remember correctly that the U.S. Scenic Byway Program was sunset a few years ago with no new byways being designated? And what are your thoughts on the modern scenic byway movement?
Okay, so I'm not sure. I do think it still exists. I mean, it's a program at the Department of Transportation where I believe states can nominate existing roads, and then they're being awarded this moniker basically of a scenic byway, and it's very different from building new roads exclusively for scenic purposes, right? So what I talked about was this idea and the reality of planning and building these roads funded by the federal government that would create these kind of scenic opportunities. Whereas, I mean, there's some in Maryland where I live, or in Virginia, so there's state highways that happen to be in locations that are more scenic than others, and there's a somewhat lengthy nomination process. There's people who evaluate it, and then there are lists of national scenic byways. The Park Service, National Park Service, wants to build a couple more national parkways right after World War II. One along the Mississippi, which would have dwarfed the Blue Ridge Parkway, of course. But the federal government and Congress in particular is no longer willing to fund these kinds of projects after World War II. And I talk about some of these in my book as well. So there's quite a bit of a difference between the Scenic Byway program, which is about existing roads being designated as byways, and these ideas from the earlier part of the 20th century, where the effort was to build new roads that would meet the definition of scenic. Okay,
that's an interesting distinction. It's kind of like the same thing with historic buildings and neighborhoods and so on. They're designated, but not built by the government.
Precisely. It's a historic preservation kind of process, right?
Yeah. Kathleen Heim asks, or states, I have read that there was a planned Green Mountain Parkway in Vermont that environmentalists successfully terminated in the 1930s. Can you elaborate on this? And she says, victory. Not sure. I guess it depends on your point of view, whether that's a victory or not.
Right. So a really interesting case is Vermont. And there was a referendum for this Green Mountain Parkway, and voters turned out against it. I mean, the majority of voters decided that this is not what they wanted. So a couple of historians have looked at that. They argue that it was about a different kind of tourism. Some of the Vermonters who voted, or the majority of the Vermonters who voted, did not want these roads because they would bring different kinds of tourists who wouldn't stay as long, right? They might just use the road to cut through the state on their way to Canada or to other places. They preferred tourists who would rent a cabin, stay for a couple of days, weeks, or even longer. There were political differences between the deal program, of course, run by Democrats, and the politics of Vermont, which leaned the other way at the time. And then, of course, you had sort of the usual suspects who were opposed, who were hikers, and what we would today call wilderness advocates, right? I mean, you call it environmentalists. So they were sort of opposed on the ground of why build a road and then invite pollution and a road that they thought would destroy these landscapes. So it's a mixture of reasons for the Vermont roads being voted against.
It's reminiscent of bringing casinos to Atlantic City to revitalize that, and because thought that people would come to gamble and then go out and patronize the clubs and restaurants and so on. And of course, it had the exact opposite effect. People came to gamble and went and left.
Right. And
it didn't do anything for Atlantic City. Now we have three comments here that are all kind of interrelated, so I'll put them together. It says here Cynthia Barris says, here in Los Angeles, we have our first freeway built as the Arroyo Seco Parkway. Now, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. My Spanish is not up to snuff. My own father's home was lost to it due to eminent domain. Curvy and bordered by parks, riverbeds, and neighborhoods, it's now hopelessly outdated and our most dangerous and inefficient highway. Now, she wonders if this is covered in your book. Somebody else also talks about the Garden State Parkway, and that's Andrew Danish. And Randy Turner talks about the Natchez Trace Parkway. He says it was created for its historic significance to a historic pathway, and that's another National Park Service area. So any comments on those particular examples?
So it's the Arroyo Seco, the Natchez Trace. What was the second? I'm sorry.
Natchez Trace and the Garden State Parkway.
Oh, okay, Garden State Parkway. Yeah, so Arroyo Seco has an important place in the plan literature because, as the member of the audience points out, it was one of the first sort of landscaped, highways. It was planned and built by the by local authorities, so it's now not a national road like the ones that I talk about. There's a paper. I mean, I can, if you give me the person's email address, there's a paper in Technology and Culture, the academic journal like Technology and Culture, but probably 15, 20 years ago by now on the Arroyo Seco that I can send to that person that talks about the significance of the road. And sort of like the Westchester County roads, the Bronx River Parkway, it's now considered by many commuters to be the road that you don't want to be on, right? Because it wasn't built for the number of automobiles, right? If you the Bronx River Parkway was built for a few thousand automobiles at most per day, which of course now you have that in half an hour, if not more. So some of these roads, right, have a reputation of being quite accident prone. The curves that were supposed to be scenic and immerse people in these lands in the scenery, right? They are very often seen as causing more accidents than there should be. And so this criticism is already prominent, right? This is your first question, Brian, from the 1950s onwards, right? So that the Arroyo Seco, some of these early parkways are seen as outdated when people really shift to commuting by automobile, right? Even Americans who have the highest, not just the highest number of automobiles, but also highest ratio of automobile ownership, in the 30s and the 40s, most of them still commute to work by streetcars. And that really changes after World War II. So Garden State Parkway. Gilmore Clark, whom I mentioned, is the main designer, and it's sort of the counterpart, if you will, to the New Jersey Turnpike, right? New Jersey Turnpike, right, is the butt of jokes. It's long, it's straight, it has lots of lanes on either side. It's not an epitome of beauty. State of New Jersey decides to build the Garden State Parkway as a toll road as well, and especially the southern stretches of the Garden State Parkway are reminiscent of these earlier parkways, although at higher speeds. And Clark is very proud of the fact that he's bringing these pre-war parkways into an automotive age and enabling higher speeds on them. So it's a really interesting road in that respect. Natchez Trace, as the member of the audience says, is built for its historical significance. It's also a National Park Service road, so it has many of the same characteristics, and is also goes on for several hundreds of miles in the American South. Not as, from my understanding, not as heavily used as the Blue Ridge Parkway, which for several years was the most visited unit of the National Park Service, period. Right, so it had more visitors than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, these very prominent parks out west, simply because everybody who goes up on the parkway and drives for 5 miles, so it counts as a visitor. So you have lots and lots of them. And it was very popular during the pandemic, as you might imagine.
That's interesting. Is the Alpine Road, the German Alpine Road, is that still in existence and still used today?
Well, so I didn't talk about the war period. And because he was so prominently sponsored by the Nazis, there weren't a lot of sponsors, right? This was Hitler's pet project. So how could you justify continuing to build that in a new federal, democratic West Germany? So it's local tourism officials who said, well, we wanted the roads even before the Nazis came around, so why shouldn't we build it? And they keep saying that for years, and some stretches are added, but it's never completed, mostly because from the 60s onwards, there's a much stronger, much more prominent environmentalist critique, right? In some of these earlier plans, it really included stretches of the road up and, at locations, at altitudes of, 5,000 feet to really go above, across the summits, where of course you would have spectacular views in your automobile, right? But that's very much no longer something that's politically viable by the late 1960s because of environmentalists and their critiques.
Okay, well, I'm interested in your comment that the Blue Ridge is the #1 attraction in the National Park Service, and
it used to be. I mean, it used to be.
Well, I've never done it, and I know a million people that have, many on motorcycles, because it's very popular because of the views and the curvy roadway. And I can assure you that at my first opportunity, I'll be going down there to check it out. So you just got another customer for the scenic road. Well, we're at our closing time now, Thomas. I'd like to thank you again for your very fascinating talk tonight, and I would encourage people to get your book. Is it available on Amazon?
Book is available on Amazon, and let me hold it up. This is a brief commercial break. It's unfortunately it's only available in hardcover, but Amazon has a lower price. There's also what's called an open access version. So if you Google my name and University of Maryland, you look at my faculty website, there's a link to the open access version, so people can read it online, the complete book online, for free, anywhere where there's an internet connection.
Okay, that's good. Well, I would encourage people to get it because I read it. I'm not an academic, but I found it fascinating and a very an interesting and easy read. It's not something you have to plow through at all. In fact, it's a bit of a page turner, I would say.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I mean, I wrote it with people like, members of this group in mind, right? People interested in cars and transportation. And there's endnotes, lots of endnotes. There's a long bibliography for anyone who wants to indulge in that. But I was, writing it in a way that I was hoping would be accessible.
Well, I read all the endnotes too, because I find you often get very interesting little nuggets of information in there. And one thing I will mention is that 2 of our very own SCA members, Arthur Krim and one other doesn't come to mind right now, were referenced in the endnotes. So the SCA had a little bit of an input there. I'd like to remind everybody about next month, when on Sunday, July the 23rd at 2 p.m. Now remember, that's not our usual time. So this is Sunday, July the 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern. We will host Andrea, or it's Andre, I think. It's a gentleman, even though the name is written Andrea Fesentini, who is a cultural historian residing in Venice, Italy. He will discuss whether racial inclusion can really be provided by vehicles designed to privatize each driver's movement across urban space. And remember that this time is different. This is to allow for the time difference between North America and Europe. SCA members will be receiving notifications and the relevant details by email in a couple of days. Others can register through the SCA website directly. To thank our guests for spending some time with us tonight. Expect an email in the next couple of days. If you're not already a member, inviting you to join. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, and that way you can take advantage of all of the services the SCA offers. And I'd also like to remind everybody that this presentation and the Q&A will be available on the SCA's website probably tomorrow. So don't hesitate to refer anybody to it if you think they would be interested. Any last words, Thomas?
I just want to thank people for coming out, for turning out, and for your great questions. It was a real pleasure.
Okay, well, and thank you very much too. So with that, I will say goodnight and hope everybody has a happy summer solstice. Yeah, this is the summer solstice. And look forward to seeing you all next month.